The international airport was alive with constant motion, the rhythmic ebb and flow of travelers filling every corner. Footsteps echoed across polished floors, and the hum of voices combined with the automated announcements that rolled endlessly over the PA system, guiding people to their flights. Yet, for Eric Gaines, felt anything but ordinary. Today was one of the most critical missions of his career, and every fiber of his being was tuned to the task at hand. Eric moved through the crowded terminal with a sense of quiet purpose. His appearance was intentionally unremarkable. A simple black jacket, dark jeans, and a small black backpack slung over his shoulder. He blended into the sea of travelers, allowing him to remain hidden in plain sight. The choice of clothing, though casual, held significance. It marked him as an unassuming, everyday man, just another face in the crowd. But Eric knew well that blending in, for him, took more than just the right clothes. For over a decade, Eric had worked his way through the ranks to become one of the FBI's most trusted agents. His sharp mind, unmatched dedication, and ability to adapt under pressure had earned him his place. Yet every achievement had come with a price. He'd had to prove himself countless times, navigating both the expectations of his role and the unspoken prejudices that shadowed him as a black man in federal law enforcement. He could feel that weight today, pressing in from all sides, adding to the tension that already saturated the airport. Eric adjusted the straps of his backpack, feeling the familiar pull of its weight against his shoulder. Inside the bag lay documents classified beyond the knowledge of most people in the airport, details essential to preventing a disaster. His team, scattered inconspicuously throughout the terminal, awaited his signal to begin their operation. All that was left was for Eric to give the final go-ahead. But there were a few last-minute details he needed to confirm. The security at the airport was visibly tighter than usual. Eric had noticed it immediately. Armed guards patrolled near the entranceways, their eyes sharp as they scanned the incoming waves of passengers. It was the kind of alertness that spoke of an unspoken tension, as if the air itself knew something big was in motion. Eric's senses were finely attuned to it. He felt the restlessness in his own body and knew he'd need every ounce of composure for the day ahead. He made his way through the terminal, passing security checkpoints and baggage claim areas with practiced ease. Eric was used to this, used to being the quiet strength behind a critical operation, the calm presence in the eye of the storm. He'd trained his team meticulously, drilling them on every possible scenario until the plan felt as natural as breathing. Even so, as their leader, the final responsibility rested with him, and he was reminded that every decision he made would influence the outcome. Finding an empty bench near the departure gates, he set his bag down with care, positioning it where he could keep a watchful eye. The cool metal of the bench grounded him in the bustling environment, and he allowed himself a brief moment of quiet before the storm. Eric scanned the crowds moving through the terminal, families with children, business travelers in suits, tourists with wide eyes and maps. Everyone seemed preoccupied, lost in their own worlds, which was exactly how he needed things to remain. He left his bag in place and walked over to a small cafe tucked along one wall of the terminal. The line was short, and as he waited for his coffee, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on everything leading to this point. This mission was monumental, not just for its stakes but for Eric personally. He understood the implications if anything went wrong, and he felt the weight of proving himself. Again, in a field where doubters often outnumbered supporters. As the barista handed him his coffee, he took a deep breath, savoring the heat radiating through the paper cup. It was a small comfort, but one he'd come to appreciate. In his line of work, Eric had learned to seize any moment of calm. However fleeting, he returned to his bench, scanning his surroundings with an instinct honed over years of fieldwork. He was aware of every detail, the angles, the exits, even the slightest shifts in the crowd's energy. With his coffee in hand, he sat back, his posture relaxed but his senses alert. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. It was a message from his second-in-command. confirming that everything was set. The mission was ready to proceed as planned. Eric responded with a single word, "Confirmed." His gaze drifted to the backpack resting beside him. A small, unremarkable item to anyone else but crucial to him. Inside were documents that could make or break the operation. As the lead, he knew that even the slightest miscalculation could spell disaster. For a moment, his thoughts strayed to the hurdles he'd faced in reaching this point. Being a black man in a high-stakes field came with unspoken challenges, a constant undercurrent of doubt he could sense but never fully name. Over the years, he had learned not to let these feelings cloud his work, instead using them to fuel his drive. But the battle was tiring, and today he felt it keenly, a quiet reminder that he had a long way to go, and that he was carrying not only his mission but his pride. Eric finished his coffee and rose from the bench, the familiar pulse of adrenaline starting to build in his veins. His eyes returned to the crowd, the steady flow of travelers and the faint hum of announcements blending into the background. Somewhere, buried beneath the ordinary day, lay the beginnings of something monumental, and Eric was prepared to face it head-on. As he took one last look at his bag, a sense of finality settled over him. He slung it over his shoulder, steeling himself for what lay ahead. His mind shifted to the details of the plan, the precise steps and timing required to pull it off seamlessly. There would be no room for error, no allowances for second guesses. In that moment, Eric Gaines was ready, focused, determined, and unfazed by the shadows of doubt. Today, he was not just another face in the crowd. He was the quiet force steering the course of events yet to unfold. Eric returned to the bench, his coffee in hand, settling in as he prepared to finalize the sequence of events with his team. The smooth metal of the bench was cool beneath him, grounding him, a reminder of his purpose amid the bustling airport scene. This was a moment he had meticulously planned for, a step he had taken countless times in his career. As he placed his backpack beside him, he allowed his mind to run through the mission once more, mentally checking each detail. Everything had to be flawless. In the midst of his quiet preparation, his phone buzzed with a notification. He quickly checked it. Another confirmation from his team, and an additional message indicating some last-minute updates. Reading through it, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, a tightening focus sharpening his thoughts. Every piece was falling into place, and it was almost time to signal the operation's start. The thought filled him with a steady confidence. As he rose from the bench and stretched, his attention still divided among his surroundings and the task at hand. Lost in his thoughts, Eric barely noticed the time slipping by as he focused on each element of the mission. That was when he saw them, the police officers approaching his bench with rigid postures and scrutinizing eyes, moving toward his bag with a palpable sense of urgency. His stomach tightened as he observed them from a distance, realizing the situation had spiraled in his brief absence. His heart beat faster. Though he remained composed, Eric knew exactly what had happened. In the high-security environment, an unattended bag had triggered an immediate response. He couldn't blame them for doing their job. Yet, as he made his way back toward the scene, he sensed a deeper undercurrent, something beyond a standard security check. Eric moved forward, his gaze steady, but before he could speak, an officer's sharp voice cut through the air, halting him in his tracks. "Stay right there, sir." The tone was firm, commanding, a demand meant to stop anyone in their place. "That's my bag," Eric called out, attempting to keep his voice calm and steady. He kept his hands visible, a lifetime of experience reminding him that every movement mattered in situations like these. The officer closest to the bag, a tall man with a rigid posture, gave him a skeptical look, his eyes scanning Eric from head to toe with an expression that was less about assessing facts and more about assigning blame. "Your bag?" the officer repeated, his tone loaded with doubt, his gaze sharp with suspicion. There was a flicker of recognition, or rather, a suspicion that Eric knew all too well. "Yes," Eric replied, maintaining eye contact. though he could feel the tension mounting around him. "I just stepped away to get a coffee. I'm back now." But his words seemed to have little effect on the officer, who continued to regard him with suspicion. Another officer joined them, slightly shorter and stockier, with an air of authority that seemed amplified by the situation. "Leaving a bag unattended in an airport is a serious offense," he said curtly, his voice ringing with accusation. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, as though even this minor explanation posed a potential threat. Eric bit back a response, choosing his words carefully. "I understand that. It was an oversight, but I assure you, there's nothing dangerous in the bag." The two officers exchanged glances, a silent communication that spoke volumes. One of them, ignoring Eric's attempts at clarification, reached for his radio, murmuring a low, clipped report into the receiver. The situation was quickly escalating beyond reason. As they spoke, a third officer approached, and Eric noticed the glances of passing travelers beginning to linger, a small crowd gathering around the scene. One of the officers squared his shoulders and took a step closer. "Identification," he demanded, extending a hand. Eric complied, reaching carefully into his jacket pocket to retrieve his FBI credentials. Feeling the weight of every watchful eye, he held out his badge, hoping the gesture would convey a sense of calm, of authority. "I'm on official business," he explained evenly. "If you contact airport operations, they'll verify everything." The officer took his badge, scrutinizing it with a look that mingled disbelief with disdain. "Official business?" he echoed, glancing over at his colleague, a smug look of doubt creeping into his expression. "What exactly does the FBI need to be doing here?" Eric held back a sigh, realizing that he was now caught in a cycle of questioning where every answer would lead to another layer of doubt. "I can't discuss the specifics, but if you verify with airport operations..." The shorter officer cut him off, his voice louder and edged with annoyance. "We're asking you what you're doing here, not airport operations. So let's get some answers." Around them, the murmuring crowd grew more restless. A woman's voice rang out from somewhere in the group. "He said he's FBI. Why are you treating him like this?" Several others nodded or murmured in agreement, but the officers ignored them, intent on their scrutiny. Eric felt the frustration rising, a heat that simmered beneath the surface. He had anticipated challenges on this mission but never expected the complications to arise from his own team's supposed allies. But he kept his composure, knowing that any sign of irritation would be perceived as resistance, a perceived threat that could worsen the situation. The officers' doubts seemed unshaken, even as they exchanged skeptical looks over his credentials. One of them reached out and grasped the strap of Eric's bag, lifting it slightly as though expecting it to detonate. "You're going to need to explain this," he said, his tone edged with hostility. Eric fought the urge to respond with an edge of his own. "This is a simple misunderstanding. If you'll allow me, I'll clarify everything with the right authorities. It's not as serious as you're making it out to be." The officer's hardened expressions showed no signs of softening. One of them, with a triumphant glint in his eyes, nodded at the shorter officer. "Call for backup," he said, a phrase that seemed to echo in Eric's mind as he watched the unfolding events. For a brief second, he glanced around, catching the eyes of the onlookers who watched in growing discomfort. Phones were out, cameras recording every detail, a detail that wasn't lost on Eric. This was no longer a private misunderstanding. It was becoming a public spectacle, and one that would likely be viewed through the narrow lens of assumption. Eric's jaw tightened. He was familiar with this story, one he'd encountered too many times. He was aware of how this looked. A black man in civilian clothes, carrying a backpack, surrounded by suspicious officers with hands hovering near their holsters. It was a familiar narrative that others projected onto him before ever considering his real identity. Taking a breath, he stepped forward, hoping to prevent the situation from escalating further. "Please," he said, his voice low but firm, This is unnecessary. You have my credentials, and I've explained the situation. I need you to contact operations immediately. The officers, however, seemed set on proving a point. I'll need you to step back and keep your hands where we can see them, one officer instructed sharply, as they began to open his bag. Resigned, Eric complied, watching as they rifled through the contents. Clothes, toiletries, a few personal items, nothing remotely dangerous. But then, one officer paused, holding up an envelope marked confidential. He looked at Eric with a raised eyebrow, a triumphant glint in his eye as though he'd uncovered a hidden clue. "What's this?" he asked, his tone loaded with accusation. Eric fought to keep his tone calm, knowing full well the implications of this moment. "Those are classified documents," he replied, his voice carefully measured, "and I'm not at liberty to share the contents with you. If you contact airport operations, they'll confirm my clearance." The officer's smirk deepened. "Classified? Ha!" He exchanged a glance with his colleague. "And we're just supposed to take your word for that?" Eric could see where this was headed, and a familiar frustration welled up within him. The weight of the public's eyes, the scrutiny of the officers, and the knowledge that his mission was slipping out of his control all added to the tension simmering within him. But he knew that, in this moment, control was his only shield. He chose his next words carefully, his voice calm but edged with purpose. "I advise you to contact airport operations before this situation escalates any further." But the officers ignored his request. Their expressions hardened with the certainty of their perceived authority. One of them grabbed his radio, speaking into it with a note of satisfaction that chilled Eric. "Backup requested," the officer said. "We've got a suspicious individual refusing to cooperate." Eric clenched his jaw, feeling the sting of humiliation as he raised his hands slowly. He'd been here before, lived this before, yet each time felt as fresh and bitter as the first. Around him, the crowd murmured, watching the scene unfold. The cameras continued to roll, capturing his silent submission, his quiet endurance, and as the officers moved in closer, he understood that the consequences of this mistake had only just begun. The officers moved in around Eric, their movements brisk and mechanical, a display of authority unfolding like a rehearsed performance. He stood still, hands raised, as a ripple of anxiety spread through the gathered crowd. Bystanders whispered and shifted on their feet, their eyes darting between the officers and Eric, whose calm presence belied the turmoil. "Step back, sir," one officer ordered, his hand hovering near his holster as he advanced. Eric complied, stepping back slowly, the weight of a dozen stares heavy on him. One officer leaned into his radio, his voice low and tense. "This is Unit 5 requesting immediate assistance at Gate C. Possible threat detained. Repeat, requesting backup." The words hit Eric like a slap. Possible threat detained, the phrase reverberated in his mind, layering insult upon the indignity he already felt. He wasn't a threat, and he had complied with every demand, offering his credentials and explaining himself without a trace of resistance. Yet, as he looked into the eyes of the officers around him, he saw the unshakable certainty of their assumptions. They had cast him as a suspect, a role he knew he could not escape simply by speaking the truth. In the growing crowd, phones appeared in hands, their cameras capturing every angle of the encounter. Some passersby voiced their discomfort, their whispers reaching his ears. A middle-aged woman near the front of the crowd leaned over to the person beside her, her voice loud enough to be heard. "I don't understand. He's not even resisting. Why are they treating him like this?" Others nodded, but their concern did nothing to soften the officers' expressions. For them, this was no longer about a misplaced bag. It was about control. Every move, every question now carried a weight that reached far beyond protocol. Eric had faced similar situations before, and he knew the game being played. If he spoke, he was challenging their authority. If he stayed silent, He became complicit in his own treatment. The officer closest to him folded his arms, his expression unreadable but hard. "What's in the documents?" he asked, a thinly veiled threat underlining his words. Eric met his gaze with calm determination. "As I explained before, those documents are classified. Contact airport operations if you need verification. My clearance will be confirmed." The officer scoffed, his mouth twisting in a humorless smile. "Classified. Convenient answer, isn't it?" Eric's pulse quickened, but he kept his tone steady, avoiding any trace of the frustration that simmered beneath his calm. "I'm here on official business. This is all a misunderstanding." But the officer ignored him, choosing instead to exchange a look with his partner, a look that spoke of authority unchecked, a shared decision to disregard whatever he said. Eric recognized this for what it was, a ritual of dominance, a reminder of the power these men wielded and their intention to use it. Without further warning, the taller officer moved forward, hands already reaching for Eric's arms. "Hands behind your head," he commanded, his voice laced with finality. Eric clenched his jaw, willing himself to remain calm. He was aware of the stares of the bystanders, of the curious, uneasy looks, and he felt the bitter sting of the moment, a moment where he, a federal agent, was now the one being subdued in the middle of an airport. Slowly, he raised his hands and placed them behind his head, surrendering to the familiar choreography of detainment. As the officer's hands grasped his wrists, pulling them down to cuff him, Eric felt a pang of humiliation that ran deeper than the physical discomfort. The cold metal pressed into his skin, a tangible reminder of the indignities he had endured time and again, each one leaving a mark. The officer tightened the cuffs with unnecessary force, his movements jerky and unyielding, as though Eric were liable to attack him at any moment. A sharp command broke the silence. "Face down!" Eric's back stiffened as he felt himself being pushed forward. He complied, lying flat against the cool, tiled floor of the terminal, his cheek pressing against the unforgiving surface. The officer's knee found its way into his back, applying pressure he knew was unnecessary. He felt the discomfort flood through his body, but he remained still, refusing to give them any reason to escalate. From somewhere above him, he heard a voice, gruff and detached, laced with an almost bored authority. "Tell us why you're really here." It was a question he could not answer in detail without risking the security of his mission. And so he repeated what he had already told them. "I'm on official business," he said, his voice muffled against the floor. "My clearance can be verified." The officer above him shifted his weight, his knee pressing harder into Eric's back. "You'll need a better answer than that." Eric took a deep breath, forcing down the wave of frustration that rose within him. He wanted to shout, to stand up and demand they recognize the absurdity of their actions. But he knew that even the slightest resistance, the smallest show of defiance, would be seen as an invitation to escalate further. Over the sound of the crowd's murmur, he could hear someone saying, "Is this really necessary?" "He's not even resisting," another voice chimed in, questioning the officer's actions. But these voices, however supportive, felt distant, unreachable. Eric knew that they could do little more than watch, helpless to intervene. Another officer knelt beside him, his face just close enough for Eric to see the smugness in his expression, the satisfaction that came with exercising unchecked power. "Not so tough now, are you?" he sneered, his words barely a whisper, meant only for Eric to hear. There was a venom in the man's tone, an undercurrent that spoke to something darker than mere duty. Eric closed his eyes, willing himself to remain calm, to avoid any reaction that might feed into their assumptions. He had learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, could be used against him. Control was his only weapon now, his silence a shield against their provocations. The officer's voice lowered, almost taunting, as he added in a low hiss, "You people always think you can walk in here and do what you want. Eric felt the weight of those words, the sting of the prejudice embedded within them, but he forced himself to remain silent, to resist the urge to respond. He knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about a system that thrived on moments like this, a system that saw him not as an agent of the law but as a threat. As he lay there, his vision partially obscured by the floor, he caught a glimpse of a young woman holding her phone, her camera pointed toward him. The recognition was instantaneous. This moment was being recorded, captured by those who refused to look away. The realization offered him a small comfort, a reminder that this injustice was not unfolding in secret. Whatever happened here, it would not go unseen. Above him, the officer shifted, his knee pressing into Eric's back, as though relishing the discomfort he caused. "You're not as important as you think," he muttered, the words dripping with disdain. Eric felt the surge of anger rise again, hot and immediate, but he bit it back. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied, his voice low and steady. "When you do, I hope you're ready to answer for this." The officer gave a dry laugh, unshaken by the veiled warning. "Is that a threat?" "No," Eric replied, his tone unwavering. "Just a fact." The tension hung in the air, thick and unmoving, as the officers held their positions. Around them, the crowd continued to murmur, voices questioning, cameras rolling, but the officers paid them no mind. They were locked into their roles, oblivious to the change in dynamic, unaware that every second they lingered only deepened the gravity of their mistake. Then, as if on cue, a figure appeared in the distance, weaving through the crowd with purpose. The man wore a dark blue uniform, his badge glinting under the harsh lights of the terminal. The officers straightened, a flicker of apprehension flashing across their faces as they recognized their supervisor. Eric's pulse quickened, a glimmer of hope piercing through the weight of his frustration. Perhaps, finally, someone would see reason, would understand the depth of the error being made. He held his breath, waiting as the supervisor approached, feeling a surge of anticipation mingled with the lingering sting of humiliation. The officers stepped back reluctantly, their authority crumbling under the gaze of their superior. But as Eric lay there, his hands cuffed, his dignity battered, he understood that this moment had already marked him. Whatever came next, whatever apology or explanation was offered, the scar of this encounter would remain. And in that moment, as he felt the weight of his cuffs and the sting of their scorn, he knew that his battle was far from over. Eric lay still on the cold tile floor, the dull ache in his back a constant reminder of the knee pressing into him, a weight designed to suppress both his body and his spirit. His wrists throbbed from the cuffs, biting into his skin as if to remind him that, at this moment, he was not a respected agent on a mission but simply a suspect pinned under a system's gaze that saw him only through its narrow lens. Above him, the officer's voice continued in clipped, unyielding tones. "This is just a routine check," he declared loudly to the crowd, his voice carrying an undertone of defensiveness. But the crowd, now a tight knot of people who had stopped to watch, saw through the pretense. Their faces told a different story, filled with a mix of confusion, unease, and, in some cases, simmering indignation. Phones were still up, capturing every word, every gesture, the scene now unfolding on dozens of screens as bystanders recorded what they saw. A murmur rippled through them, the voices growing louder as the seconds ticked by. "Hey, he's already explained himself," a man called out from the crowd, his tone more assertive than questioning. "Why don't you let him up?" Another voice, this time a woman's, joined in. "This is ridiculous. He showed you his credentials. He's with the FBI." But the officers ignored them, seemingly locked in their determination to assert control, to maintain the narrative they had begun. Eric could feel their resistance, their refusal to yield, and he understood that their actions had now taken on a life of their own. They couldn't back down, couldn't admit they might have been wrong. Not here, not in front of an audience that was steadily growing more vocal. One of the officers, noticing the crowd's shifting mood, adjusted his posture, his body language a mixture of irritation and discomfort. He glanced at his partner, an unspoken question in his eyes, but the other officer shook his head in a barely perceptible motion, as if to say, "We're sticking with this." From his position on the floor, Eric could see the shifting expressions of those watching. Some had their brows furrowed in concentration, their eyes sharp with a sense of justice. Others appeared hesitant, unsure whether to intervene directly or simply keep recording. But one face caught his attention, a woman who had stepped forward, her phone still in hand. Her eyes locked onto his. She gave him a nod, a silent message that she understood what was really happening here, that she saw him, saw past the labels that had been placed upon him. Eric met her gaze, a brief but steady connection, and in that moment, he felt a strange sense of strength. His voice was silenced by the circumstances, but hers was not, and she, like so many others around him, wasn't turning away. The officer who had his knee pressed into Eric's back glanced up, his jaw tightening as he noticed the wave of dissatisfaction rippling through the crowd. "Stand back," he ordered, his voice louder now, directed at the bystanders. "This is a security situation. We have it under control." "Under control?" A man's voice rose above the murmur, laced with incredulity. "Is that why he's lying face down in cuffs?" Others echoed the sentiment, their voices taking on a sharper edge, pushing back against the officer's authority. With every second that passed, the tension in the air grew thicker, fueled by the public's growing awareness that what they were witnessing wasn't an act of security but an abuse of it. Another officer approached, this one holding a small electronic device. He looked at the officer holding Eric down and said in a low tone, "Supervisor's on his way." Eric felt a pang of relief, tempered with caution. He'd learned not to put too much faith in authority figures, knowing that they often sided with their own. But the fact that a supervisor was coming suggested a potential shift. At the very least, the arrival of a higher-ranking officer might bring a pause to the situation, a moment to explain, to be heard. He remained still, his eyes focused on the ground, listening as the voices around him continued. The woman who had been recording him, the one whose nod had given him a moment of strength, stepped closer, her voice louder now, filled with a quiet authority. "This man has rights," she said, addressing the officers directly. "I don't care what he's being accused of. This treatment isn't right." Her words struck a chord, igniting a fire among the crowd, who murmured in agreement. Some nodded, while others muttered expressions of solidarity, their eyes fixed on the officers with a mixture of defiance and expectation. Eric could feel the shift, the subtle change in the dynamic. For the first time, he felt as if the power of the officer's assumptions was beginning to crack under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. The officer who had been holding him down shifted uncomfortably, his posture betraying his growing unease. But his tone remained defiant. "Ma'am, we're handling this according to protocol." "Then why does it look like an arrest?" she countered sharply. "He's shown you his ID. He told you who he is." Her words lingered in the air, challenging not only the officers but the very system they represented. The officer's jaw tightened as he looked away, unwilling to meet the crowd's eyes. Eric could see the cracks forming in their confidence, the silent admission that they had perhaps overstepped, that they were trapped by a decision they could not back down from without conceding defeat. The sound of footsteps approaching cut through the tension, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark blue uniform emerged from the crowd. His badge, gleaming in the fluorescent lights, identified him as the supervisor the officers had been awaiting. He took in the scene before him with a glance, his gaze shifting from the officers to the crowd, assessing the situation with practiced efficiency. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice steady but edged with authority. He looked down at Eric, his face a mixture of surprise and concern as he took in the sight of the restrained man lying on the floor. The officer holding Eric hesitated, then straightened, stepping back reluctantly. "Sir." This individual left a bag unattended and became uncooperative when questioned. The supervisor's gaze moved to Eric, his eyes narrowing as he took in the details. But unlike the others, his scrutiny lacked the hostile edge Eric had grown accustomed to. There was curiosity there, perhaps even a hint of understanding. Eric lifted his head, meeting the supervisor's gaze, seizing the opportunity to finally speak. "My name is Eric Gaines," he said, his voice steady but firm, each word carrying the weight of his experience, his professionalism. "I'm with the FBI. I'm on official business. If you contact airport operations, they'll confirm everything." The supervisor's eyes widened slightly, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Eric could see the internal calculations, the shift in understanding as the supervisor began to grasp the implications. The man turned to the officers, his face darkening. "Did you verify this information?" he asked sharply, his tone laced with reproach. The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Sir." He refused to cooperate. "And we were following protocol." "Protocol?" The supervisor interrupted, his voice icy. "Protocol doesn't justify this." He gestured to Eric, still lying prone on the floor, the cuffs biting into his wrists. "Get him up. Now." The officers exchanged glances, their faces pale, their bravado gone. They moved to help Eric to his feet, fumbling with the cuffs as they unlocked them. Eric flexed his wrists, feeling the sting of relief, but also the lingering frustration that gnawed at him. His dignity had been bruised, his authority undermined, all because of a system that refused to see beyond its own bias. The crowd murmured in approval as Eric straightened, brushing off his jacket and regaining his composure. The supervisor turned to him, his expression regretful. "Mr. Gaines," he began, his voice low, meant only for Eric. "I apologize for the actions of my team. This never should have happened." Eric looked at him, his gaze steady, and nodded slightly. "No, it shouldn't have," he replied, the weight of his words carrying both forgiveness and a demand for accountability. The supervisor's shoulders sagged slightly, as if under the burden of his team's failure. He turned to the officers, his voice cold and unyielding. "I expect to see a full report from each of you, and we will be discussing this in depth." The officers nodded, their faces flushed with embarrassment as they shifted uncomfortably under the gaze of the crowd, who watched them now with expressions of judgment and disdain. The phones were still recording, documenting every second of their quiet humiliation, a reversal that now cast them as the ones under scrutiny. Eric took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. He looked at the crowd, at the faces of those who had defended him, who had spoken out against the injustice they witnessed. For a brief second, he allowed himself to feel their support, a quiet strength that countered the bitterness lingering in his chest. As the crowd began to disperse, Eric felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see the woman who had spoken up, her face serious but kind. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said simply, her eyes reflecting a mixture of empathy and frustration. Eric gave her a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of her courage, of her voice that had cut through the noise to offer a glimpse of justice. "Thank you," he replied, his voice low, the words laced with gratitude, "for seeing what they couldn't." With that, he straightened, adjusting his bag on his shoulder and casting one last look at the officers who now stood in a small huddle, their authority diminished, their confidence shaken. And as he walked away, he felt a shift within himself, a reminder that, even when systems failed, voices could rise, piercing through bias and injustice to remind him that he was not alone. And although his mission was far from over, he knew this incident, this moment of resistance, would fuel him in the battles that still lay ahead. The supervisor, Sergeant Thomas Daniels, approached the scene with long, Quick strides. The murmuring crowd around Eric parted to let him through, their expectant gazes settling on the man who was now the focal point of everyone's attention. Eric stood tall, his wrists still marked by the cuffs that had only moments ago been removed. Though his body was tense from the ordeal, his face remained impassive, his expression giving away none of the frustration that simmered just beneath the surface. Daniels took in the scene before him, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, the officers, and finally, Eric. The supervisor's expression shifted subtly as his gaze settled on Eric, his face a mask of professionalism that revealed a hint of concern. It was clear he recognized that what he had just walked into was no routine check, no standard protocol. This was a situation that had already spiraled out of control. One of the officers, attempting to regain some composure, took a step toward Daniels, his voice stiff with an attempt at confidence. "Sir, this individual left a suspicious bag unattended. When we questioned him, he became uncooperative." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his mouth tightening slightly. "Did he? Now?" His voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was a hardness to his tone that made the officers shift uncomfortably. He didn't look at Eric but kept his focus on the officers, an unspoken reprimand lingering in his stance. Eric watched the exchange silently, sensing that this was his chance to set the record straight but choosing to let the supervisor speak first. Daniels folded his arms, looking at each officer in turn. "And did any of you confirm his identity? Did you make an attempt to verify his credentials before escalating this situation?" The tallest officer cleared his throat, his gaze darting briefly to Eric before landing back on Daniels. "Sir." He presented an ID, but he refused to give details about his business here. "We thought it best to treat him as a security risk, given the circumstances." Daniels let out a slow, measured breath. He finally turned to Eric, his expression softer but laced with a question that needed answering. "Mr. Gaines, I assume?" Eric nodded, his voice steady and calm as he spoke. "Yes, Eric Gaines, FBI Special Agent. I'm on official business, and I was only here because my team and I are running a classified operation." He gestured toward the bag that had sparked this entire incident. "The documents they found are highly classified. I asked them to contact airport operations to verify my identity and clearance, but that request was ignored." Daniel's face darkened, the realization of what had unfolded settling into his expression. He turned back to the officers, his jaw clenched. "So, let me get this straight. You detained a federal agent on a classified mission, ignored his credentials, and escalated this into a public incident, all without taking a moment to verify his clearance." The officers stood silent. The confidence they had displayed moments ago now faded to an uneasy stillness. The shortest officer shuffled his feet, his gaze fixed somewhere to the side, as though hoping to avoid the wrath in Daniel's eyes. One of the bystanders, a woman who had been recording the incident, called out from the edge of the crowd, her voice thick with indignation. "They didn't just detain him, they humiliated him, and they did it without any real reason." The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration bubbling over, creating an atmosphere heavy with a sense of injustice. Daniels raised a hand, signaling for quiet. He turned to the officers, his expression filled with quiet anger. "This incident has been recorded by half the people here," he said, his tone low but resonant. "And you can be sure that every second of this mess is going to be scrutinized. Not just by airport management but by our department." Daniels glanced back at Eric, his eyes reflecting a mix of regret and respect. "Mr. Gaines, on behalf of the airport security team, I apologize for the actions of my officers. This situation was mishandled from the start, and I assure you, it will not be overlooked." Eric met his gaze, his voice level. "I appreciate that, Sergeant Daniels. But apologies don't undo what just happened." He gestured to the crowd. "Everyone here saw what unfolded, and everyone knows why." Daniels nodded, his face taut. "You're absolutely right. This isn't just a matter of procedure, it's about perception. And we failed in that regard. He turned back to his officers, his voice laced with steel. I expect each of you to submit a full report. And rest assured, this will be reviewed by Internal Affairs. The officers' faces went pale, their earlier bravado completely extinguished. The shortest officer, who had been the most vocal in his accusations, opened his mouth as if to defend himself. But a single look from Daniels silenced him. Daniels took a deep breath and motioned for one of the bystanders recording the scene. Ma'am, please come forward. I'll need any footage you have from this incident. He spoke loudly enough for the crowd to hear, making it clear that he was taking responsibility. The woman nodded, moving forward to share her video with Daniels, who thanked her with a grave expression. Eric watched the crowd slowly begin to disperse, their collective murmurs filled with outrage and sympathy. He noted the faces of those who had supported him, their expressions reflecting a mixture of frustration and vindication now that the situation was shifting. As the crowd thinned, Daniels turned back to Eric, his voice lowered. Mr. Gaines, I can't undo what happened here today, but I can assure you that there will be consequences. This kind of behavior doesn't reflect the values we stand for. And it shouldn't have come to this. Eric nodded, his voice carrying a calm, restrained anger. I hope so, Sergeant Daniels. This isn't about me alone. It's about the system. Incidents like this aren't isolated. They're part of a bigger problem. Daniels' face tightened, understanding the weight of Eric's words. I know, he replied quietly, and for what it's worth, I'm committed to addressing it. There was a sincerity in Daniels' voice that Eric hadn't expected, a hint of frustration that matched his own. For a moment, he saw a glimmer of someone who understood the limitations and failings of the system they both served. He could see that Daniels wanted to make things right, but Eric also knew that promises were easy to make and hard to fulfill. Make sure that you do, Eric replied, his gaze steady. Daniels nodded, giving a single, sharp inclination of his head before addressing his officers. You're dismissed. I'll handle this from here. Report to my office within the hour. The officers filed away, their shoulders hunched and faces flushed with embarrassment, casting nervous glances back at Eric as they departed. The last remnants of the crowd dispersed, some offering Eric sympathetic nods, others casting lingering glances at the scene as they moved away. The airport slowly returned to its steady hum, as if attempting to erase the tension that had just hung over it. Daniels turned back to Eric, his face still solemn. If there's anything else I can do, you have my contact information, he said, handing Eric a business card. And once again, my apologies. Eric accepted the card, tucking it into his pocket. Thank you, Sergeant Daniels. I'll keep that in mind. As Daniels walked away, Eric took a moment to gather himself, brushing off his jacket and adjusting the strap of his bag. The weight of the encounter still clung to him, a reminder that the struggle against prejudice and bias was far from over. He took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from his body, replaced by a steely resolve. He had a mission to complete, a team waiting for him, and lives depending on his success. The actions of a few prejudiced officers would not deter him. If anything, they had strengthened his resolve, reminding him of the broader purpose that guided his work. He took one last look around, noting the lingering stares of a few onlookers, before setting off toward the terminal's restricted access area. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his second-in-command, confirming that his team was in place. Eric's shoulders relaxed slightly, his focus returning to the mission at hand. He tapped out a quick response, affirming that he was en route to their rendezvous point. He straightened his posture, regaining the composure that had been briefly shaken but never broken. With every step, the memory of what had just unfolded began to settle into a cold resolve, a reminder that he was not only here to complete a mission but to stand firm against a system that, all too often, saw him as a threat before it saw him as a man. By the time he reached the security doors, he was once again every inch the agent he had trained to be: calm, focused, and undeterred. He swiped his clearance card, hearing the click of the lock release, and stepped into the secured area where his team awaited. As the door closed behind him, he let go of the humiliation of the past hour, compartmentalizing it as he had learned to do countless times before. There would be a time to address it fully, to push for accountability, to demand changes. But for now, there was a job to be done, and nothing, not even the shadow of prejudice, would prevent him from completing it. The airport had returned to its usual rhythm. But the fallout from Eric's detainment was only beginning. The video captured by several bystanders had gone viral within hours, spreading across social media like wildfire. Outrage poured in from all corners, people condemning the officer's actions, calling for accountability, and demanding answers from the airport security team. Eric's name was not unknown within law enforcement circles, and now, for the public as well, he had become a symbol of both resilience and of a deeper, systemic issue. Back in his hotel room, Eric sat on the edge of the bed, his phone buzzing nonstop with calls, messages, and notifications from his colleagues and supporters. His team had completed the mission without a hitch, and yet the events from earlier loomed large over him. He had barely closed his eyes since the incident, his mind racing as he watched his face plastered across news headlines and hashtags online. No matter how often he had dealt with prejudice in his career, this moment had a weight of its own, and he knew it would not simply fade away. Eric's second-in-command, Mason, sent a quick message. "Just saw the press release from the airport. Might be worth a look." Mason attached a link, and Eric clicked it, bracing himself. The airport's official statement was straightforward, but it contained the usual language Eric had come to expect. Words like regret, misunderstanding, and protocol dotted the brief, with a vague promise of an internal investigation into the incident. There was no direct apology, no acknowledgement of the racial profiling that had fueled the situation, just a carefully worded release designed to quell public outcry and protect the institution. Eric closed the statement, feeling the familiar burn of frustration in his chest. The language of bureaucratic apologies always danced around the real issue, shifting responsibility without ever acknowledging the heart of the problem. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about a system that routinely saw people like him as suspects first, professionals second, if at all. His phone buzzed again, this time a call. It was Sergeant Daniels, the supervisor who had intervened at the airport. Eric hesitated for a moment before answering. "Gaines here," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Mr. Gaines," Daniels began, his voice slightly strained. "I wanted to reach out to personally apologize once again for what happened yesterday. I've submitted my report, and I wanted you to know that I recommended disciplinary actions against the officers involved. What they did was unacceptable, and we're addressing it as quickly as possible." Eric appreciated the directness, but he remained cautious. He had been through these cycles before: apologies, investigations, promises of change, and he knew that follow-through was often lacking. "I appreciate your call, Sergeant Daniels," he replied, "but I think we both know that this isn't just about those officers. The system they represent has deeper issues, and a couple of disciplinary actions won't change that." Daniels was silent for a moment, the weight of Eric's words settling between them. "You're right," he finally said, "and I'll be honest. This has forced us to confront things we've been brushing under the rug for too long. There are some in our department who would rather sweep this whole thing away quietly, but I won't be one of them. We're bringing in an external review team to investigate the department's policies, and that's largely because of you. Your situation has brought issues to light that can't be ignored." Eric absorbed this quietly. It was a step, he knew, and one that might have a lasting impact if it were taken seriously. But he also knew that change, especially systemic change, required constant pressure. "What will this review involve?" Eric asked, his tone even. but with a trace of skepticism. Daniels took a breath, the exhaustion evident in his voice. The review team will look into our use of force protocols, as well as our training on racial bias and de-escalation tactics. We're also reevaluating the reporting process, making it easier for officers to report incidents like this without fear of retaliation. Eric nodded, a faint glimmer of hope tempered by the knowledge of how many times he had heard promises like these before. Change, he knew, wasn't just about policies, it was about attitudes, about deeply ingrained biases that took far more than a few new rules to uproot. "Thank you, Sergeant Daniels," he said finally. "I hope this review goes deeper than most do. People's lives depend on it." Daniels' voice softened. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise you that I'll do everything in my power to make it real." The call ended, and Eric let the phone rest on the bed, staring at it for a long moment. The reality was settling in: his name, his image. His story would be tied to this incident for a long time. His agency was supportive, but he could already feel the whispers forming in the back channels. People asking if the attention might compromise his future assignments. A notification popped up on his phone. A message from the director of the FBI. "Eric, I want you to know that we support you fully. Your commitment to this agency is not in question, and we will stand behind you during this investigation. We'll work to ensure that this never happens to you, or anyone else, again." The message gave him some reassurance, but it was laced with implications. While it was a strong show of support, he knew the agency was also trying to manage the optics. This incident was larger than any individual, and the FBI's interest in ensuring justice would also be about maintaining its reputation. Later that day, Eric attended a press conference organized by the airport's management team. He wasn't there to speak, but rather to observe, to hold the institution accountable in a way they couldn't ignore. The room was filled with reporters, cameras clicking, pens ready to jot down every word. The airport's head of security, flanked by Sergeant Daniels and a few other senior officials, stepped to the podium, clearing his throat before speaking. "Thank you all for coming. Yesterday's incident involving Mr. Eric Gaines has highlighted areas where we, as an institution, have failed. We apologize unreservedly to Mr. Gaines for the treatment he endured and to the public for any distress this incident may have caused. We are committed to a full investigation, and we are already taking steps to reform our policies." The reporters' hands shot up, and the head of security pointed to one of them, a tall woman with a crisp suit and a piercing gaze. "How do you plan to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future?" The head of security hesitated, glancing at Daniels, who stepped forward. "We're implementing mandatory bias training for all our officers," Daniels said firmly. "We'll also be increasing accountability measures, ensuring that all incidents are reported transparently, and creating a system where any behavior that doesn't align with our values can be addressed swiftly." Eric listened intently, his arms crossed. It was a promising start, but he knew that real change required more than words spoken in front of cameras. Another reporter asked, "Mr. Gaines, can we hear from you? Do you feel that these measures will be enough?" Eric felt every gaze in the room turn to him, but he maintained his composure as he stepped forward. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, then addressed the room. "I've spent years serving this country as an FBI agent, dedicating myself to protecting lives and maintaining justice. Yet, even as a federal agent, I am still seen, first and foremost, as a threat by some. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a system that too often fails to see beyond its own biases." The room was silent, every eye fixed on him, his words hanging heavy in the air. "Change is more than a promise," he continued. "It requires action, accountability, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. I will work with Sergeant Daniels and others to ensure that this review doesn't just scratch the surface. I owe that to myself, to the people watching, and to everyone who has experienced the same injustice." As he stepped back, he noticed a few nods of respect from reporters. and even Daniel's expression had softened, a trace of admiration flickering in his gaze. The press conference ended, but Eric knew his work had only begun. He had become a reluctant advocate, a public face in a battle he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. As he walked away from the podium, he felt a renewed resolve settle over him. This moment, this incident, would be more than a mistake brushed under the rug. He would see to it that it became a catalyst for something greater, something that might just change the lives of others like him. And as he left the building, stepping out into the bustling city street, he felt the weight of both his own story and the stories of countless others on his shoulders. It was a heavy burden, but one he was willing to carry. Days after the incident, Eric received an invitation to attend a public forum at the airport, a meeting to discuss what had happened, but also an apology meant to be delivered not only to him but to everyone who had witnessed or been affected by the event. He debated whether to attend, feeling both the weight of his own frustration and the skepticism that lingered from a lifetime of navigating bureaucratic apologies. But, ultimately, he decided to go, recognizing that his presence would send a message far stronger than any press statement. The airport's main conference hall was filled with reporters, airport employees, and community members. Eric entered quietly, slipping into the back row, hoping to blend in with the crowd. But his presence didn't go unnoticed. Heads turned, and whispers spread quickly as people recognized him. He felt the mix of curiosity and empathy in their gazes, some even giving him a small nod of respect. On the stage, Sergeant Daniels sat alongside the head of airport security, both men looking slightly uncomfortable under the intense scrutiny of the cameras and the eyes of the public. A small group of people stood near the podium. Eric recognized them as the officers involved in his detainment. The taller one, who had been the most aggressive, fidgeted nervously, his eyes downcast. The shorter officer, who had questioned his authority the most, seemed tense, his face drawn tight as if he were bracing himself for the moment to come. The head of security stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and began speaking, his voice steady but tinged with discomfort. "Thank you all for being here today. We've gathered to address the incident that took place here at the airport several days ago. An incident that has since gained national attention. I want to acknowledge Mr. Eric Gaines, who is here with us today. He is a highly respected FBI agent who was wrongfully detained due to misjudgments made by our security team." He paused, glancing back at the officers who stood behind him, visibly uncomfortable under the spotlight. "Mr. Gaines, on behalf of the airport and our security department, I offer a sincere apology for the actions of my team," he continued, his tone shifting to one of genuine regret. "We failed to uphold the standards of respect and professionalism that every individual deserves, and for that, we are truly sorry." Eric watched the head of security closely, noting the way his eyes flickered with sincerity yet hesitance. There was an air of reluctance, as though the apology were a necessary display but one he wasn't entirely prepared to confront in its full weight. Still, Eric appreciated the effort and decided to keep his silence. Allowing them to continue, Daniels stepped forward next, his posture stiff but his expression somber. He met Eric's gaze, his face tightening with the discomfort of someone who bore some responsibility for the actions of those beneath him. "Mr. Gaines," Daniels began, "I was the one who ultimately arrived on the scene, and I take full accountability for what happened that day. My officers acted out of line, and although we are taking steps to rectify this incident, I realize that an apology alone cannot undo the harm caused." The room was silent as Daniels continued, "We're committed to changing the culture within our team. As I said during our last conversation, this is not just about policies or protocols. It's about confronting and eradicating the biases that led to this incident." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, a collective acknowledgement that this was more than just an isolated occurrence. Eric could sense the weight of their shared frustration and expectation, the silent demand that this moment be more than a symbolic act. Then, Daniels turned to the officers standing on stage. One by one, they were called forward to address Eric directly. Each step seemed to add to their discomfort, their faces showing the strain of public accountability. The taller officer, the one who had cuffed him with unnecessary force, was the first to speak. He stepped up to the microphone, glancing at Eric before dropping his gaze, unable to maintain eye contact. I want to apologize, Mr. Gaines," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I misjudged you, and I didn't take the time to consider what you were saying. I understand now that I was wrong." He paused, visibly struggling to find the words. "I didn't see you for who you are, and that was a failure on my part, both as a security officer and as a person. I'm truly sorry." Eric watched him closely, measuring the sincerity in his voice. There was genuine remorse there, a humility that Eric had not seen during their first encounter. The officer's discomfort spoke to the realization that his actions had consequences, not just for himself but for the person he had humiliated and the broader public now watching. The shorter officer stepped up next, visibly uncomfortable, but his apology was more clipped, his tone betraying a sense of defensiveness. "Mr. Gaines," he began, "I apologize for how I handled things. I was doing what I thought was necessary at the time. I can see now that I was wrong, and for that, I'm sorry." Eric's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the undercurrent of resistance in the man's tone. It was an apology, but it felt thin, lacking the self-reflection he had seen in the previous officer's words. He understood that change would not come easily to everyone, that some would resist confronting their biases, even when faced with the truth. The last officer stepped forward, his apology softer but earnest. "Mr. Gaines," he said, his voice steady, "I can't imagine what it felt like to be treated that way. I can only say that I'm sorry for my role in it. I'll be taking this experience to heart, and I'll work to ensure that nothing like this happens again. Not on my watch." When they had all spoken, Daniels turned back to Eric, signaling that the floor was open for him to respond if he wished. Eric hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't come with any intention of making a statement, but he felt the weight of the room's expectation, the silent encouragement of those watching. He rose from his seat and walked slowly to the front of the room, every eye fixed on him as he took his place at the podium. For a moment, he let the silence settle, allowing his words to carry the full weight of his experience. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "Thank you for your apologies. I accept them, but as I'm sure you understand, accepting an apology doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It doesn't erase the experience." The room was silent, the crowd holding their breath as they absorbed his words. "What happened to me at this airport isn't unique," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "It's part of a larger issue, one that affects people who look like me every day. I am not here just to receive an apology. I am here to ensure that this incident becomes a turning point, a moment where we recognize that racial profiling and bias cannot be overlooked, cannot be brushed aside with a single act of contrition." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. He could see the reflection of his own resolve mirrored in the faces of those around him. "I've dedicated my career to protecting this country, to serving justice," he said, his voice growing stronger. "And I believe in a justice that doesn't just punish, but that transforms. I believe in accountability, but also in change." He turned to Daniels, his tone softening slightly. "Sergeant Daniels, I appreciate the steps you're taking to confront the biases within your department. It's a start, but it's only the beginning. Real change will require constant vigilance, a willingness to look beyond procedures and see the people impacted by them." The room remained silent, but Eric could feel the power of his words resonating within the space, a sense of collective resolve beginning to take root. "To the officers who detained me," he continued, turning his attention to them directly, "I understand that we all make mistakes, but I ask that you take this experience seriously. Don't let this be a one-time lesson. Let it be a shift in how you approach your job. how you see the people you serve. Change comes from within each of us, and the choice to make that change is yours." The officers nodded, their expressions solemn, and Eric sensed that some of them understood. Even if not all were willing to admit it, he turned back to the crowd. "To everyone here, thank you for being present, for bearing witness. It's our collective responsibility to ensure that incidents like this are not repeated, that we hold ourselves and our institutions to higher standards." With that, Eric stepped back, his words hanging in the air as he returned to his seat. A quiet, respectful applause rose from the audience, their acknowledgement of his stance, his strength, and his call for lasting change. As the forum concluded, people approached him, some offering quiet words of support, others sharing their own stories of encounters with bias. And as he stood among them, Eric felt a sense of purpose solidify within him. This journey was far from over, but he knew that each step, each conversation, would ripple out, challenging the system one moment at a time. And as he left the conference room, Eric knew that this apology had not only been a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing but a spark, one that, with enough care and persistence, could ignite real, lasting change. The echoes of the public apology still lingered in Eric's mind as he prepared to return to his main task, the mission that had brought him to the airport in the first place. The apologies, the promises of accountability, and the words he had spoken to the crowd were all steps in the right direction. But they were only a part of his journey. Now, his focus shifted back to his duty, to his team, to the mission, and to the lives that could depend on his every move. The airport's administrative corridors buzzed with their usual hum of low voices, clicking keyboards, and the faint shuffle of security personnel. Eric moved swiftly, his posture tense but steady as he made his way to the secure room where his team waited for him. His mind was still processing the events of the past few days, compartmentalizing them in the way he had mastered over years of handling high-stress situations. It was part of his survival mechanism, a technique that had allowed him to balance his responsibilities as an agent with the challenges he faced as a black man navigating the complexities of his role. When he entered the operations room, his second-in-command, Mason, stood from his position, eyes scanning Eric with a concerned but focused gaze. "Boss, glad to have you back," Mason said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of relief. "We've been monitoring everything on our end. The team is ready to go on your command." Eric nodded, feeling a familiar surge of adrenaline begin to replace the tension that had settled in his shoulders. "Good work, Mason. Bring me up to speed." Mason handed him a tablet, which displayed a real-time map of the airport terminals, marked with tiny dots that represented the different points of interest and positions of his undercover agents. Eric scanned the layout quickly, noting the markers, the exits, and the areas where his team had positioned themselves. Every detail was a piece of a larger puzzle, one he had spent weeks preparing and strategizing to control. "We've tracked the target's movements," Mason explained, his voice calm and precise. "They're expected to land in less than an hour. We have agents positioned near each exit point, and the transfer teams are on standby. So far, everything is in place." Eric nodded, absorbing the information with a quiet intensity. His team had been preparing for this moment for months. Each agent was stationed exactly where they needed to be, the coordination of movements perfected through numerous simulations. Yet, despite the confidence he had in his team, he knew that in situations like these, the slightest error could unravel everything. The mission involved intercepting a dangerous individual who was attempting to smuggle classified materials out of the country. This person was well-connected and elusive, known for evading law enforcement in the past, and the stakes were high. Any misstep could put civilians in danger or, worse, allow sensitive information to fall into the wrong hands. "Any updates on our assets at customs?" Eric asked, his eyes scanning the room as each agent focused intently on their respective screens. "They're ready," Mason confirmed. "Security has been briefed and cleared on the procedure. They know the target but haven't been given all the details. As far as they're concerned, it's just a routine check on someone under suspicion. Eric appreciated the discretion. The fewer people who knew the full extent of the operation, the better. This mission required precision, careful timing, and absolute control over each step. And he had no intention of letting anything, not even the fallout from the recent events, interfere with its success. As he studied the maps and listened to Mason's briefing, Eric's phone vibrated with a notification. A message from FBI headquarters flashed on the screen. HQ, all eyes on you.
Agent Gain.
Complete the mission as planned. We have full confidence in your leadership. The message was both a reassurance and a reminder of the expectations he carried. He understood the stakes, but he also knew that the events surrounding his detainment and the public backlash had turned this mission into more than a routine operation. Every step he took now would be under heightened scrutiny, a dual challenge he was prepared to face but couldn't ignore. Eric set the phone aside and looked up. Meeting the eyes of his team, each member displayed a quiet strength, a shared focus that reminded him of why he had taken on this responsibility in the first place. The trust they had in him was unspoken but palpable, and it fueled him as much as any directive from HQ. All right, everyone, he said, his voice calm but firm. We stick to the plan. No deviations unless absolutely necessary. This needs to be as smooth as possible. A few heads nodded, and he caught Mason's steady gaze as he gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. The team dispersed, each agent taking their respective positions at the screens or stations, readying themselves for the upcoming task. The minutes passed in a tense silence, each one pulling them closer to the target's arrival. Eric's mind was a steady flow of calculations, scenarios, and contingencies, all organized and compartmentalized. His years of training had conditioned him to handle these moments, to embrace the tension and use it to sharpen his focus. Finally, a voice came over the comms, the clear tone of one of the agents stationed near customs. Target spotted. They've cleared security and are moving toward the baggage claim area. Eric straightened, his attention zeroing in on the location. He tapped his earpiece, his voice steady and low. All units, eyes on the target. Maintain your positions and wait for the signal. The feed from the airport security cameras displayed the scene in real time. A stream of people milling through the baggage claim area, dragging suitcases and exchanging brief greetings. And then, amid the crowd, Eric saw him, the target, a man in his late 40s, with a calm, composed expression that masked the secrets he carried. He moved with a practiced casualness. Just another traveler in a sea of faces. Eric's heart rate quickened, though he maintained an outward calm. Mason, confirm our agents at all exits, he ordered, his voice steady but urgent. Mason's fingers moved deftly across his tablet, checking each location and confirming the positions of their agents. Confirmed. Every exit is covered. Eric watched the screen intently, his gaze never leaving the target. His instincts were honed and focused, and every detail mattered now. All units, be ready. We move on my mark. The target moved closer to the exit, his pace steady, his face unreadable. Eric could see the tension in his posture, the slight stiffness that betrayed his knowledge of the stakes. It was a subtle sign, but it told Eric everything he needed to know. The target was aware, but he wasn't fully prepared. It was the slight edge they needed to bring him down without a public spectacle. Mark, Eric said calmly, giving the final command. The agents moved as one, converging on the target with a precision that had taken months to refine. In an instant, the area was sealed off, each agent taking their position to ensure that no bystander was at risk. No path open for the target to escape. The target stiffened, his face turning cold as he realized what was happening. But the agents acted quickly, escorting him from the crowd with swift professionalism. Within moments, the scene had quieted, the target secured and the mission completed with minimal disruption. Eric let out a slow breath, the weight of the successful operation settling over him with a sense of calm satisfaction. His team had moved flawlessly, each member performing their role with precision and trust in his command. As they escorted the target out of the airport, Eric's phone buzzed once more. A brief message from HQ. Mission completed. Excellent work. Gaines. Eric allowed himself a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the message. This mission had been about more than just one target or one day. It had been a test, a challenge to his focus and his resolve in the face of obstacles that extended beyond the mission itself. As he regrouped with his team, Mason approached him, a faint smile breaking through his usual serious expression. Smooth as could be. "Boss," he said, his voice filled with pride. Eric gave a slight smile, a rare show of satisfaction. "You all did great work. This wouldn't have happened without every one of you." He felt the quiet camaraderie in the room, a shared respect that went beyond words. Each agent had proven themselves that day, not only to Eric but to each other, reaffirming the strength of the team they had built together. As the team began to gather their equipment and wrap up the operation, Eric stepped aside, allowing himself a brief moment of reflection. He thought of the incident, the apology, and the promises of change, and he knew that the journey toward real justice was far from over. But today, they had succeeded in their mission, in spite of everything that had threatened to stand in their way. And as he left the airport, walking through the same halls where he had once been detained and humiliated, he felt a renewed resolve. This was his work, his duty, and nothing, not prejudice, not the lingering shadows of bias, would keep him from completing his mission. Today had proven that, and he would carry that certainty with him into every battle yet to come.